were paid a compliment. And I just want to share that next week, we're also going to have another speaker. It's one of 3 people. You'll hear, we'll send a note out to the ALI people, but it'll be obviously a different angle of this topic, but this topic before we begin the last week in November with Daniel Levine coming back for a fascinating 4-part class. You know, Daniel's major in school was Jewish philosophy. So this is the first time he's actually piloting, major philosophical debates. Not unlike Shai Cherry did for the foundations class many years ago, but from a Daniel perspective in a different way. And this is going to be the beginnings of a course that he's going to start teaching at UCI. So I think we're going to be very lucky, and that begins at the end of November. But I'll let you know who next week's speaker is very soon. And with that, welcome everybody. And Scott, thank you for being here. Scott is a professor at Cal State University Fullerton. American politics is his forte. But about 10 years ago, when he realized that no one was teaching anything about the Middle East on the Cal State Fullerton campus, he actually went with Olive Tree Initiative on a trip to Israel to sort of learn about what they do. Did spend a lot of time researching different curriculum from around the country on the situation in the Middle East, and put together his own course, which I think he has now taught for at least 6 years. And without further ado, here we go.
I think it's been 5. And it's important that you mentioned that when I was, first of all, thank you so much. And Ria, I feel bad you're going to hear the exact same talk I gave at Regent's Point. But I will say that that trip to the Middle East with the Olive Tree Initiative had a profound impact on me. And what was important about it is that it began in Jordan. And I'd never been to Jordan before, and I spent some time there, and we spoke with the way the Olive Tree Initiative works, and this is going to tie into what I want us to talk about right now, is it exposes you to the wide diversity of political, economic, cultural, and other kinds of leadership in the Arab world and in the Israeli world. In Jordan, the West Bank, we were in Ramallah, we were in Bethlehem, we met with the Palestinian Authority, we met with settlers in Hebron, we met with left-wing activists in Israel. And that just cemented for me how complex and challenging it is to really understand the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, let alone the wider Middle East. And personally, as a Zionist, I really felt like it was my obligation to understand. And so I kind of did that for a while. I thought when I go on this trip and I'd come back, and I'd easily be able to put together a course, and it took me another a few more years before I really felt able to do that. Marcia, you have to allow me to share my screen so I can put my PowerPoint up.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint that I put together for today's talk. Oh, and of course, everything comes up as soon as here it is. And it's always hard to move things around on my screen. All right, so whenever I teach the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I'm at Cal State Fullerton, which I'm teaching next semester, yikes. I use a book that's co-authored by 3 political scientists, Shaul Feldman, an Israeli, Abdul Manem Saeed Ali, an Egyptian, and Khalil Shikaki, a Palestinian, all of whom are senior academics at the top of their game. And their approach, which I've adopted, is to find agreement on the historical record but then to offer narratives that provide a full-throated representation of their respective national views, nationalistic views, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli. So rather than me telling you or my students which one of these views is correct, I want students to understand the complexities and the widespread disagreements among the chief protagonists in this intense 100 years plus conflict. The need for that kind of approach is only, so apparent now, as we had trouble agreeing on not only how to handle the horrible violence that and war that erupted on October the 7th, which continues to this minute, and which are dividing people all over the globe, but also we have conflicts now over how to even talk about this. So, right, I don't need to explain what happened on October 7th, except to reiterate that it began with an attack from Hamas, a surprise attack, massive one, which killed, original estimates were 1,400. New estimates are coming out of the Israel Defense Forces that about 1,200 innocent Israelis were killed, and 240 hostages were taken, and Israel declared war in response on Hamas. And as its military started this long campaign, first bombing and now ground as well. And so far, international estimates say that 11,000 Gazans have already been killed. And so it's not surprising to any of you to hear that more are likely to die. We're talking about IDF young soldiers, Hamas terror operatives, thousands of innocent civilians as well. So I'm trying to give you a little background for understanding these grave, momentous events. And I'm going to try to focus where I can on identifying divergent narratives that really matter. So I pick and choose the things that I think are most relevant to giving the context that I think is required here. So I'm going to focus first on, to borrow from Tolstoy, War and Peace. And obviously there are more wars and more efforts to make peace than what's here, but these are what I consider to be the key inflection points these are the big ones. These are the big wars and the major peace agreements. So in 1948, there was, of course, what Israel will call the War of Independence. It's War of Independence, and we'll celebrate every year. And Palestinians call it their great catastrophe, the Nakba. In 1967, we're talking about the 6-Day War, which Israelis will say they Israelis will say they fought for their very survival against an array of Arab armies, chief among them Egypt and Syria, who are ready to attack them. The Egyptians will say that Israel attacked. Israel say that it was launching a preemptive defensive attack. Egypt will say Israel is aggressive, was the aggressor here. The Palestinians call this the Naksa, or the setback. So very different views on these things. I also want to talk a little bit about the 1973 Yom Kippur. I'm just giving you the headlines right now, and then I'm going to come back and lay out some more details about these things. In 1973 was the last time that Israel was caught off guard at at the same intensity that just happened this year. And that was on Yom Kippur. Israel was attacked by Egypt and Syria. And from the perspective of Egypt and Syria, that they were launching a war to regain lands that were appropriated illegally by Israel in 1967. So there were very different perspectives. Now, alongside of this, there's a number of different peace agreements, which I want to focus on. What the key ones that I think are particularly relevant. In 1979, Israel signed its very first peace agreement with any Arab country since its birth in 1979 with Egypt. By the way, with Anwar Sadat who was the president of Egypt, also who launched the 1973 Yom Kippur War, signed a long-lasting Egyptian Israel peace agreement, which is still in place to this day. We'll talk a little bit about the efforts from 1993 really to 2002 or 5, we can decide when it ended, to create a two-state solution, beginning with the Oslo Accords in 1993 and the famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, the president of the Palestinian Authority at the time, with President Clinton on the White House lawn, which ushered in a whole range of peace efforts, including a successful 1994 Jordan Israel peace agreement, and then the very recent Abraham Accords, where 3 Arab countries, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, normalized relations and trade with Israel, essentially peace agreements. Saudi Arabia in the background, giving hints that maybe they would be next. And since that time, there was, just prior to October 7th, increased efforts for Saudi Arabia to normalize relationships with Israel. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail because they're really important. So in 1947, at the end of World War II, and you're looking at this map that occurred at the end of World War II, in the wake of the Holocaust, which wiped out, most of European Jewry, the United Nations, brand new United Nations, offered to partition what had been a British colonial mandate since World War I. Now, a couple things and you can see this was the original proposal on the left. So that was the United Nations General Assembly partition plan. And these brown areas were the proposed Arab state. This is a two-state solution. This is the birth of the two-state solution idea. And the blue areas were the proposed Jewish state. The Holocaust had created this incredible consensus that the survivors of that horror must be compensated. And the idea of never again emerged, of course. And so the Zionist case seemed almost self-evident to the Western publics. And at the same time, a process of decolonization had been taking place in the Middle East. Lebanon had asserted its independence in 1943, Jordan in 1946, Syria in 1946. For the Palestinian Mandate, which was held by England, at the end of 1946, there were twice as many Arabs living in this area as Jews, 1.3 million Arabs and about 608,000 Jews living there. So the UN wanted to divide the area, giving half and half, essentially. The Palestinians refused this partition. They said, look, this was their land, and they don't want to they're the majority, they don't want to take half the land. The UN had passed this resolution 181 that partitioned the land. The Zionists accept the offer, the Arabs rejected it, and Israel declared itself independent on the land that the United Nations had offered, and a war ensued. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq all attacked the newly formed state. Israel drove back the assault and won this war. Now, Palestinians, as I said before, see this as their national catastrophe, the Nakba. At the time, between 700,000 and 750,000 Palestinians were exiled off of their ancestral homes, some violently. There were some armistice lines drawn, and but the conflict was just beginning. In the aftermath, the United Nations passed another resolution, Resolution 194, and which included Palestinian refugees' rights to return to their ancestral homeland. The Palestinians declared an all-Palestinian government headquartered in Gaza, right? So this is the first moment when Gaza starts to become very significant. Under Egyptian rule, Gaza would be under Egypt, not under the Israel's rule. And the all-Palestinian government, the APG, declared they didn't want to cooperate. So they declared all of Palestine from the river to the sea, essentially, a unified nation. And they said all of Jerusalem is their capital. So that only just set things up for a series of wars and efforts to make peace between Israel and Palestine. The most significant war after that, not that there wasn't other wars, 1956, for example, but in 1967, Israel, as I mentioned before, attacked Egypt preemptively. They saw this as a necessary move. You can see here's Israel before the 1967 war, essentially these same borders from the 1949 armistice agreements after the 48 war, the War of Independence, the Nakba. And you can see what happened afterwards. Israel really gained a huge amount of territory. That was a 6-day war. It was very quick. Israel basically enlarged its size by 2/3. And it took the West Bank. You can see here the West Bank. It took from Jordan. And East Jerusalem is a piece of that, also from Jordan. So for the first time, Israel unifies Jerusalem as a result of the 67 war and has all of Jerusalem under Israeli rule and annexes it right away, by the way. And took the Golan Heights, these very important for national security. They are higher up, so gives a military advantage to whoever controls them. They took those from Syria, and they took this entire Sinai from Egypt. From the Israeli narrative, right, this was a war of defense. They were being surrounded, right, by the Arab armies that had tried to destroy it in 1948, had tried to fight it consistently since that time, and were arrayed on its borders and were ready to attack it, backed by the Soviet Union, that also supported Egypt and Syria at that time. And so Israel felt that it was in a war for its own survival, and it attacked preemptively only to save itself. From the perspective of the Arabs, however, Israel was an aggressor, taking land that it had always wanted in the first place, and used an excuse of this preemption to actually take over all of this land, and that this was exactly what Israel was always planning to do. So this continues to augment hostilities, right? Now, there's one other important thing to point out here, which is really critical, which is this is when the occupation, the modern day occupation that Palestinians talk about a lot, and many Israelis acknowledge as an occupation, begins. Because in the aftermath of this war, right, there is a agreement that the land that Israel has taken as a result of this war, it must return. The United Nations says it must return. Now, Israel understood this as saying that essentially UN Resolution 242, that Israel must return the land after the Arab countries acknowledge Israel and make peace with Israel. Then Israel will return the land. And this is where we get this idea of land for peace. The Arab countries understood it quite differently. They understood that Israel should return all the land first that they captured illegally. And then after that, then they will make peace with Israel. So completely divergent views of this. Israel, in terms of the Gaza Strip, which we're going to focus on a lot now, Israel stationed troops in Gaza and began to build settlements in the newly occupied territories, not only around West Jerusalem in non-Arab areas, but also on the Gaza Strip in defiance of international law that says that they had to return this land. In Gaza, there was about 1 million refugees that were in Gaza at that time that were left under Israel's rule. I'm going to come to this in a minute. The defeat also left a fledgling Palestinian national movement and ignited it. I'm sorry, I should say, and invigorated it, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization emerging and gaining new influence. All right, so a third war relevant here. So the PLO emerges from here. The occupation gets established, right? And now there's, in 1973, known in Israel as the Yom Kippur War, known in because Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Yom Kippur. In Arab nations, it's just referred to as the October 1973 war. Anwar Sadat, who launched the war, felt it was justified to get back the Sinai, right, that Israel had taken in 1967. Israel bounced back from an initial attack that really caught it off guard. For the first 4 days, Israel really felt like they might lose this war. They were terrified. They're shaken from their military confidence that had emerged after 1967. After that 67 war, the labor government that had dominated Israel since the beginning of the country, right? Ben Gurion was essentially a labor prime minister, and every president, Golda Meir was the prime minister, labor prime minister. Labor controlled the Ministry of Defense. So labor had dominated the country, and it was mostly an Ashkenazi labor government. They had been totally shaken from their confidence and the public's confidence in them. So what happened in this war was that Egypt essentially won back the Sinai. Israel handed back the Sinai, but Israel defended itself. Well, not quite. Egypt won part of the Sinai, I should say, here in this area. Israel defended itself, ultimately retaining almost all of the lands from 1967. But the politics of Israel domestically fundamentally changed. The Agranat Commission there was a commission appointed to investigate what happened. How did we get caught by surprise, right? How did Moshe Dayan, who's pictured here, Golda Meir, these vaunted, right, this military establishment that had won such a big victory in 67, how did they lose this war? And the commission faulted the highest levels of leadership. Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, resigned, as did Prime Minister Golda Meir, who took it upon herself to say it was entirely my fault. And the Labor Party never again regained its dominance that it had had from the start of the country. And in fact, just a few years later, in 1977, Menachem Begin and the Likud party seized power, won resounding elections in Israel. And that was the first time the Likud party ever became the national party, national governing party. And Menachem Begin became prime minister, its first prime minister. Now, of course, there are so many similarities to today's situation with that surprise attack, which is why I wanted to get into it a little bit. The 1973 war also elevated Yasser Arafat, who is the leader of the PLO. There was a summit in Rabat in October of 1974, and all of the Arab nations recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the, quote, sole representative of the Palestinian people. And then Arafat spoke before the UN General Assembly, which had also granted the PLO observer status. Just to take note, in 1968, under Egypt's sort of, mentorship, so to speak, under Sadat's, the PLO forged this charter which called for the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle and proceeded to engage in a campaign of terror involving hijackings, high-profile hijackings of airplanes, Westerners, Israelis, the massacre of Israeli athletes at the 1968 Olympics. So this is all happening just around that same period in the eruption of the 1973 war. There was also oil, the issue of oil. By the 1970s, the massive value of oil and the production of that in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, became abundantly clear. So it wasn't clear to the United States that they should necessarily throw in all of their eggs in the basket of Israel because of the strategic value of oil and the importance of securing support from the Arab nations. Not to mention the fact that we were in the midst of a heightened level of Cold War in the aftermath of Vietnam, and the Soviet Union being very powerful in the Middle East. And so so the United States wanted to match the Soviets in its appeal to the Arab countries as well. So the Nixon administration was reluctant to get behind Israel in the 73 war. It ultimately did and supported it in critical ways militarily. But there's this shaking of this, we imagine today that Israel and the United States always had this rock solid alliance, and that America's always stood. True in many ways, but it should be noted that America also was concerned with trying to secure alliances with Egypt and with Saudi Arabia at this moment in time as well. Okay. In 1977, Anwar Sadat paid a historic visit to Jerusalem, having already tried to defeat Israel militarily, not once, but a few times, most intensely in 1973, but afterwards as well. They now sought a diplomatic route. And this was the first time that a leader of any Arab nation had visited Israel. Sadat came to Israel, spoke to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and Menachem Begin reciprocated, went to Cairo. And by 1978, Israel's conservative Likud government, its first conservative government under Menachem Begin, agreed to a peace treaty with Egyptian Anwar Sadat, who had waged war against Israel not once, not twice, several times. So in case this gives me a lot of hope, this peace agreement, which still stands to this very day, because nobody would have imagined this would ever have happened. When Menachem Begin was elected in 1977, a lot of Israeli labor supporters said, that's it, we'll never have peace with any, because Likud was very openly belligerent. And that was Begin's reputation. And Sadat was the war maker, right? And all of a sudden we have this peace agreement, which was profound. The other thing I want to say about this is, in this peace agreement, Sinai is returned to Egypt. So land for peace. Israel honors that approach. Once the peace agreement is signed, the Sinai is returned. Israel wanted to return Gaza to Egypt. Egypt didn't want it. Sadat believed that was Palestinian land and it should be given back to the Palestinians. And so Israel maintained its occupation of the Gaza Strip after this agreement until 1994, really. And it maintained some settlements in Gaza until 2005. Okay. Now, in 1979, there was also, the same year that we were signing this peace agreement, Israel was signing this peace agreement with Egypt, there was the emergence of a competitor to the secular nationalist PLO. And I want to make this point. Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization were nationalists. They were not fundamentally Muslim, not saying that they aren't Muslim, but that wasn't who they were, right? They were a nationalist, secular nationalist movement for independence. But there was a growing influence of the Islamists in Gaza in particular and in the West Bank. Originally part of the Egyptian-based Muslim Brotherhood, led by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who would become ultimately the founder of Hamas, which is why I mention it. Now, this comes out of course, the Islamic Revolution in Iran that same year, which had fueled the politicization of Palestinian Islamists in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. And it inspired this Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood to create a brand new group, Islamic Jihad, which has been very active in today's, in our current October 7th and beyond. So both the Muslim Brotherhood, which would become Hamas in Gaza, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad were supported by this brand new Iranian Muslim theocracy. In 1987, the first Intifada or uprising began. This took the Palestinian Liberation Organization by surprise. This was a grassroots movement, mostly stone-throwing youth, but it became increasingly violent as it continued until the early 1990s. And this is the moment where the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza changes its name to Hamas under Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And Hamas essentially means, it's an acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement. Now, Hamas, many of you know this, has a number of goals. First of all, they want an Islamic caliphate in all of historic Palestine. So they reject any idea about a two-state solution all the way back to 1947. They don't accept that. And they really reject the PLO because the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1988, the year after the start of the First Intifada, says that they accept a two-state solution in their Declaration of Independence. Hamas's founding charter calls for the destruction of Israel and for the destruction of Jews, literally. I read it a few weeks ago. Now, it's since been updated in 2017. They've moderated. They don't call for the death of all Jews. They only call for the destruction of Israel. And they continue to reject the two-state solution, although they would accept a Palestinian state in the 1967 borders, pre-1967 borders, but they would say that that was temporary. So that's where Hamas really emerges from. And just let me reiterate that they're really a contrast to the Palestinian Authority, and I'll show you more about that. Now, in 1990, the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War essentially ended, and America emerged as a unipolar power, right? Prior to that, there was in the 60s, 70s, I talked a little bit about the importance of the Cold War for the Middle East and shaping America's response in 1973. Competitive backer of Egypt and secular nationalist movements for independence against Israel. And now the United States is the only superpower. And this is followed immediately by the 1991 Gulf War, and where there's this multilateral coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein and push them out of Kuwait. By the way, the PLO sides with Saddam Hussein, which creates massive problems for the U.S. relationship with the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And then there's the very first multilateral Arab-Israeli peace conference in Spain, in Madrid, Spain. And as a result of these larger global systemic changes and some political changes in Israel returning labor to power with Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin as the new leader of Israel, in 1993, there is this historic agreement, the Oslo Peace Agreement, which was basically a agreement on principles to create a two-state solution, right? It provides a framework for a peace process. But this is historic. Not only, and it's historic for a couple of big reasons. By the way, a lot of this was negotiated in the back rooms by academics, shout out for professors. First, before it was presented to Arafat and Rabin, who accepted it and then agreed to it under the prompting of President Clinton. So in this agreement, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, for the very first time, recognized UN Resolution 242, recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security, renouncing terrorism. And Israel accepts PLO as the sole representative for the Palestinian people. And then it goes on and lays out a 5-year program to end the occupation. And this is followed, no, by the way, right after that agreement in 1993, Israel relinquishes parts of Gaza and parts of the West Bank, Jericho, Ramallah, most of Gaza, except for a few settlements, Israeli settlements, relinquished to the interim Palestinian government, which then becomes the permanent Palestinian Authority. And the exchange is that Palestinian guerrilla groups are going to stop all the violence, stop all the terrorism. And that includes the Palestinian Authority having responsibility for stopping Hamas from launching attacks from Gaza into Israel. Problem was, they couldn't stop Hamas. And Israel, therefore, refuses to dismantle its remaining settlements in Gaza. Okay, in 1994, this is followed up immediately with the second historic peace agreement between Israel and another neighboring country, with Jordan, and this is the second, very significant. Now, the Oslo process, as I mentioned, I showed you in this, is going to be 5 years, and it's quite complicated, right? So the idea behind it essentially is, right away, Israel withdraws from Jericho, Ramallah, most of Gaza, a few other cities, 9 other cities, Arab-dominated cities in the West Bank. And then it divides the West Bank into 3 areas. Areas A, which I just described, Palestinians have full control, policing control, as well as governing control. Areas B, which you can see these sort of red areas, which are Palestinian civilian control, but Israeli security control. And area C, all of these brown areas, which Israel regains, continues full control. And right away, first of all, this is initially, the idea is that the areas that are B will eventually, in that 5-year period, be transferred to Palestinian control, and they'll become like areas A. And areas C will become areas B. And eventually all of it will be returned to control by the Palestinian elected government in the West Bank, including a capital in East Jerusalem. Not that East Jerusalem would be under military control or controlled by the Palestinians, but they could have their capital there. Now, at first, this was seen quite optimistically by both Israelis and Palestinians. Palestinians felt, oh, we're going to finally get our independent state. Israelis felt like they would finally be ending this war with the Palestinians. But over time, Hamas, well, let me say, Hamas, right from the start, said, absolutely, we will not accept two states. And over time, many other Palestinians joined their opposition. It was seen ultimately as an effort by Israel to expand building of settlements, which is places that Jews will live in the West Bank, which was supposed to be returned in a process, all of it to Palestinians. But Israelis were starting to settle in different parts of the West Bank. And many Palestinians started to believe that the entire Oslo process was really a ruse, that Israel had, tried to fool all these, to buy themselves time to slowly annex the West Bank. Okay. So the Oslo Accords are backed up by the second set of practical agreements to essentially establish this government in the West Bank and Gaza with a capital in East Jerusalem, a two-state solution. But in 2000, the entire thing came to a crashing halt. There were a lot of efforts after 2000, which I'm going to get into in a minute. Camp David, for example, came close to I'm going to come back to this slide in a minute. This is out of order. So in 2000, the catalytic event that ended the peace process really was a visit to the Temple Mount, which is in East Jerusalem, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, by IDF General Ariel Sharon, and this it didn't violate any laws, but it violated norms by that no Israeli politician had ever gone to that Temple Mount. And not since 1967, since Israel regained control of East Jerusalem. Violence erupted after Sharon went there, and a second intifada emerged, led by Hamas predominantly, but other militants like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Palestinian Authority had its own version, the Al-Aqsa Brigades, launching horrible suicide attacks, killing hundreds and hundreds of Israelis, innocent, and bus bombings and suicide attacks at Passover Seders and pizza restaurants, and this was predominantly fueled by Hamas violence. Israel responds with military patrols throughout the West Bank, and eventually by building what they called a security fence. All of this blue area becomes fenced in by the Israeli security wall or fence, right? Palestinians will call this the apartheid wall. And in some areas, it looks like this. In other areas, it's much smaller. And here's a painting by the famous protest painter, graffiti artist Banksy on a part of that wall. So Israelis argue that the building of this fence and the many military checkpoints in between areas A and B and C that are all there still today in the West Bank. Sharon divided the West Bank into 64 different autonomous, different separate regions and put military checkpoints in between and built this wall all around it. The Israelis will argue this was necessary and it was simply a response to the violence. Prior to the Second Intifada, there was no such wall. Those military checkpoints were many fewer. And Palestinians argue that this was an effort for Israel to sort of take over the West Bank, and that and to create a system of apartheid. They argue that the suicide bombings were already stopping as Hamas backed off when this was built. So but Israel will say it worked. Suicide bombings were reduced by 60% after they built this wall. So as the violence abated in 2005, let me just say, this ends the peace process. I'm going back really quickly, but I did want to call attention to there was a number of efforts, even after the start of the Second Intifada, for Israel to work with the United States under President Clinton and then under President Bush to come to a peace agreement, most memorably in Taba in 2001, where Ehud Barak, nearing the end of his prime ministership, with the writing on the wall that the Labor Party was losing all political support, that there would be a re-election of Bibi Netanyahu very soon, tried to negotiate a final peace agreement with the Palestinians, with Arafat and Clinton, and offered up to 94% of the West Bank and a capital in East Jerusalem. Ehud Barak says, and Dennis Ross, U.S. Negotiator for the Clinton administration, say that Arafat walked away from this. In fact, President Clinton went on national television and said this whole thing was destroyed by Arafat's refusal to make peace. Arafat says that the offer was a verbal offer and that he was simply hoping to see it in writing and that he wanted to think about it and walked away from those negotiations. Barak said it's a take it or leave it deal. You either sign right now and we're done with this whole thing. We're no longer at war. We have a peace agreement, two-state solution. Arafat saw it very differently. President Bush went further and continued to try to negotiate a roadmap to peace with the United States, the Russia, the EU, and the United States, the quartet, trying to organize another path to peace, none of which have worked, because in 2005, this Second Intifada erupted, and in 2005, as the violence is sort of abating, Prime Minister Sharon decided that Israel would unilaterally withdraw from its settlements in Gaza Strip. And this was, as he called it, a disengagement. And the idea was to limit all conflict. I'm going to come back to the slide in a minute. So these were the Israeli occupation settlements, I should say, in the Gaza Strip, and all of them had to be evacuated. And it was Israel's military used against Israeli settlers in the Gaza Strip to push them out in 2005. Now, in 2006, Hamas, which had established social and educational programs in Gaza since the 1990s, rode a wave of popularity to an election victory. There was Palestinian elections in 2006, by all international observers, fairly. It was a full election, fairly conducted, and Hamas won a majority of the seats. As soon as Hamas won, Israel imposed a land, air, and sea blockade on the Strip. And human rights organizations say that encirclement, that military encirclement of Gaza, stifled the economy and had devastating impact on life in Gaza. An estimated 80% of the 1.3 million Palestinian refugees in Gaza rely on aid from international sources, and over 500,000 live, this is before the October 7th war, live in refugee camps. Now, Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization, not only by the United States and Israel, but by the European Union, by Canada, by Japan. And so all of these sanctions were imposed on Palestinians, and foreign aid was suspended. And in 2007, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas started to fight with each other. There was a civil war, essentially, among Palestinians between the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, and their dominant party, Fatah, that was Arafat's party, and Hamas. And this prolonged fighting, mostly in the Gaza Strip, but some in the West Bank, left dozens dead. And on June 14th, 2007, President Mahmoud Abbas dissolved the entire government. Right? So you can see this is what Gaza looks like right now. This is the Rafah crossing over here. You can see how densely populated it is. Here's Gaza City, where the Israeli military is now steadily moving in and further as it's surrounded and moving in there. But I just thought this was a really particularly good and detailed map of the Gaza Strip. And you can see that basically Israel surrounds all of this border here. Egypt surrounds this border here. And then there's the Mediterranean Sea. And Israel militarily blockades it. And Egypt as well has shut off travel in and out of the Rafah crossing. I'm talking about before October 7th. So in 2006, this was the election, right? You can see Hamas, the Change and Reform Party, won a resounding victory. And immediately Israel, the United States, European Union said, right, look, there's you either accept Israel and renounce terrorism, or we're imposing sanctions. Hamas said no way, and they continue on, right? So I really wanted to just make this point. This is a very important point, that Hamas governs Gaza Strip now. It had a military coup in 2007 after Abbas had dissolved the government, took over Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, runs the government in the West Bank of Israel. Hamas's ideology is Islamist. Fatah, which runs the West Bank, is secular. The strategy, Hamas says it's going to destroy Israel. That's armed resistance. Fatah says it wants to negotiate a two-state solution with Israel. Hamas doesn't want to ever recognize Israel, would accept a temporary Palestinian state in 1967. At least that's what they said in 2017. And Fatah says, we recognize Israel. Starting in 1993, they did. And they want to build a state on those 1967. So not a lot ultimately of difference between Hamas and Fatah in terms of what they want as an outcome, at least temporarily, but fundamental differences in their style and their approaches over the years. Hamas is, you can see the current leadership of Hamas right now, which is a complex, well-organized organization. People refer to it as a terrorist organization, but it's a terrorist organization and a government. Ismail Haniyeh is the political leader of Hamas. He was elected in 2017. Let me just say that again, elected in 2017, re-elected in 2021. In contrast to Mahmoud Abbas, who hasn't had an election since 2003. Haniyeh, who basically is the leader of Hamas, was a right-hand aide to the Sheikh Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas. And Yassin was killed in an airstrike by Israel in 2004. Then there's the Shura Council, which is nobody knows really who's in there. And they elect the Politburo, which Haniyeh leads. So the Shura Council elects this, but Haniyeh is in charge. On the West Bank, there is Saleh al-Aruri, and in Gaza, it's Yahweh Sinwar. You might have heard a lot about him recently, who had been in Israel's prisons before being released as a part of a prisoner swap for Gilad Shalit in 2011. So Hamas had taken prisoners before, taken hostages before, and this was just a single soldier. Hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, Hamas including Sinwar, were released in return for Gilad Shalit. Mohammed Daif is the leader of Hamas's military, which is the Al-Qassam brigades. Okay. So one question I wanted to ask was, why now, right? Since 2007, Israel has had repeated wars with first Hezbollah from Syria, financed and supported by Iran, Islamic militants in the south of Lebanon, which still present itself as a major threat to Israel, armed with precision-guided missiles, hundreds of those that cannot be defended against by Israel's Iron Dome. But more importantly, now 5 wars between Israel and Hamas based in Gaza. First in 2008, then in 2012, then in 2014, and again in 2021, and now in 2023. So the question is, why now? Why did Hamas decide to launch this attack right now? Which and the way I look at it is on a level of 4 different levels of analysis to try to understand this. The first is sort of a global systemic analysis. What's happening with the United States, right? I mentioned before with when the United States emerged as a unipolar power after the fall of the Soviet Union. After that, a peace process opened up in Israel. There was also an election in Israel with the Labor government returning. But really, that was so important that the United States became the dominant world power without any real competition from the Soviet Union, that opened up the possibility for a 2-state solution and a peace process in the Middle East in the 90s and the early 2000s. But recently, United States unipolar power has been challenged, both by Putin in Russia and by China. And essentially what I'm arguing here is that the United States is distracted. And that sets up an opportunity for Hamas to take Israel off guard. But it also means that the United States is not focused on trying to create peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The United States has been dominated in its concerns with the war in Ukraine and its the growing threat of China. A second piece of this is regional. So you got the global systemic, America distracted, the rising power of Putin and China. And then you've got the recent establishment of the Abraham Accords, where, as I mentioned before, Bahrain, Morocco, United Arab Emirates, all normalized relations with Israel, all for the first time, right? This was the biggest advance in peace for Israel with Arab countries since the 1994 peace agreement with Jordan. Under President Trump, under Netanyahu, again, conservative governments creating peace agreements. Interesting sort of book to write about that. And then more recently, the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, growing in its signals that it is ready to normalize relations with Israel as well. And here you can see the Crown Prince meeting with President Biden and with speaking in backroom deals with the Netanyahu government about potentially doing this. Now, Hamas, kind of seeing this, kind of understood that the Palestinian cause is being sidestepped. Arab countries are going ahead and moving ahead to normalize relationship with Israel without dealing with the Palestinian issue at all, which is exactly the opposite of what the Palestinians want. So they feel ignored. This is threatening to them. And then there's the domestic level, both in Israel and in Palestine. Let me just start really quickly with Palestine. I've already mentioned the division between the West Bank under Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and in Gaza, the dominance of Hamas. This creates and Hamas launching a series of wars with Israel. Mahmoud Abbas has not held an election for the Palestinian Authority in well over since 2003. And there have been a couple of times where he's canceled elections. He's quite senior and he's deeply unpopular. In fact, recent public opinion polling by Palestinian public opinion pollster Khalil Shakaki, one of the authors of the textbook I use, show that in a head-to-head match between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in elections for the Palestinians, Hamas would win. Any other candidate, not Palestinian Authority, not Mahmoud Abbas, would beat Hamas. In other words, Mahmoud Abbas is so unpopular, the Palestinians prefer Hamas to it, but they prefer almost any other leader to Hamas at this point. So that's very unstable. And we're not sure who's going to emerge after this war. In Israel, like you guys know, I'm sure you are aware that there's been deep political conflict over the Netanyahu government's move to the lurch to the right to undermine the independence of the national judiciary, to increase settlement in a building in the West Bank in an aggressive way. And there have been constant protests every single week for the last 9-10 months in Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been in the streets peacefully protesting against the Netanyahu government. So this is just one picture of one of those protests, clearly at the Western Wall. Hamas, seeing this distracted Israel, Israel's very consumed with this conflict. Some Israelis describe it as almost at the level of a civil war, the hatred and the acrimony between the Netanyahu government supporters and the right wing and the Haredi, the religious extremists in Israel, and the secular, more liberal leaning Israelis that are the throughout the country, like you might see in Tel Aviv, that this is almost kind of a civil war. That creates a vacuum as well. So very unstable in Israel, very unstable in the Palestinian arena, and Hamas exploits this in attacks. But that tells you when, right? There is opportunity. Doesn't really get at the why part. The long-term occupation of the West Bank and the military encirclement of Gaza by Israel, and Egypt's decision under their President Sisi to close off the border between Gaza and Egypt, including all of the tunnels between Egypt and Gaza, which have been a lifeline for millions of Gazans living, right? This creates a untenable situation that has been boiling and boiling for decades. Some might even say, Palestinians might say, for over 100 years. And Hamas, which has been very unpopular in the Strip and in the West Bank, is seen as preferable to Mahmoud Abbas. And so these contextual factors opened up a window of vulnerability, and Hamas took advantage of it. They took advantage of it as they sensed their declining significance. And they launched this attack to put themselves back into the driver's seat. Now, there are a number of different ways we can understand this, the narratives of this. From the Palestinian narrative, Hamas attacks are a manifestation over this anger on the Gaza stemming from the occupation and the military encirclement of Gaza. And there are two basic versions of this. One is this was justified resistance. And you'll see a lot of protesters on college campuses saying that, right? That this is the only way to get Israel's attention and the world's attention for Palestinian suffering. We've tried peaceful means. There's another version that says the violence itself of Hamas is unjustified. Hamas is unpopular, but the attacks nonetheless flow out of these longstanding grievances that the Palestinian people have with the military occupation and the increasingly brutal occupation on the West Bank, as well as even more so in the Gaza Strip, not an occupation on Gaza, but encirclement, that Israel is responsible for addressing, right? Now, obviously, the Israelis have a very different vision of this, and that just sort of, I want to end this and we'll open it up for some questions if you want. From the Israel's perspective, Hamas's attacks were inhumane, vicious, a fundamental violation of basic human rights. They were also meant to exploit Israel's vulnerable leadership situation that stems from their domestic conflict. And under no circumstances can it ever be seen as understandable, let alone justifiable. Now, there are two versions of this. One says that Israel has to respond, forcefully destroy Hamas completely. And if this means massive casualties in Gaza, so far 11,000 people dead right now by international observers, the blame for that is Hamas. They're the ones who embed their forces in hospitals and schools. A different version of the Israeli narrative is that Israel absolutely must root out Hamas militants, destroy Hamas to the extent possible, but that it should also be mindful that its efforts must be careful about reducing civilian casualties to the extent that they can, even if that means that their attacks on Hamas are less effective, because there's going to be a day after this, and that Israel is still going to have to live with Hamas on its border. Not Hamas, I'm sorry, with Gaza on its border. And the way that's going to get resolved is going to depend in large part on how Israel conducts itself during its military operations. So those are the narratives as I see it, as I would describe it. And I'll end and open it up for any questions about any aspect of what I've talked about or anything else. I just silenced you. You know, this happened at the Regent's Point too, when I like sort of unloaded this whole complex history, which is missing huge parts, by the way, huge parts. But I just wanted to give you the sort of the core basics as I see it. Very few people want to say it. Yes, I see you raising your hand. Go ahead, Neil. Do you know how to unmute? Please unmute yourself.
So first of all, I want to say I appreciate your presentation. It's really a great summary of the history and the context of the particular war. And I particularly appreciate the balance of your presentation of presenting it from the complex different perspectives. I think the one thing I want to question is talking about the 6-day war only with the threat of armies aligned on the borders, and not including the blockage of the Straits of Tiran, because that was, I think, a major issue in preventing Israel to have trade with Asia, not being able to have shipping through that. I mean, it really was like a death knell to Israel economically. So, what's your feeling about that?
No, absolutely. I wasn't going to do a full treatment of the causes of that war, but after the 1956 Suez Sinai conflict, in which United States, Israel, and Soviets were together, Israel said, if you ever block the Suez Canal again, Israel will cede to Egypt. Israel will take that as an act of war. And exactly what you said, this was part of the reason why Israel felt like Egypt was already waging war on Israel. And not to mention that there was tremendous amount of rhetoric. We're going to wipe Israel off the map coming out of Nasser's Egypt. Right before the war, the armies were arrayed right on the border of Israel, right, in the Sinai. And then there was a tip-off from the Soviets, false, we find out later, that Egypt was ready to attack any minute. And so Israel decided to take a preemptive strike. So absolutely, that was a critical moment. That was a critical piece of this, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, Ria.
So at this point, a lot of people are looking at the political stability, both in Israel and, say, in Gaza, Hamas's power. So it could either entrench Netanyahu even further and give him and his coalition government greater power, or the opposite. And the same for Hamas. So if it entrenches Netanyahu and the coalition and gives more credence to Hamas worldwide, it's a very dangerous path. So I don't know if you can predict what's going to happen.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, first of all, I think you're right to be fearful of that. And like I said, the main thing to be aware of is there's just tremendous instability in Israel and in the Palestinian camp. But I will say two things about what you say. Netanyahu's popularity is through the floor. People, and it's not just because Netanyahu had always promised, like, you may not like my policies with the Palestinians, but I will keep you safe, and the others, Lapid, and won't be able to keep you safe. I've always kept you safe. Well, that didn't happen. This is the worst attack on Israel. And after the 73 war, you can see what happened, that, labor lost its authority, its dominance of Israeli politics for a long time. I think that likely that's that we're headed to that kind of situation. There are many people in the Likud who've had it with the Likud military establishment. Every single member of the Netanyahu government, including Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, has apologized and taken responsibility for the military failures. Every single person except for Bibi Netanyahu, who will not publicly say that he was responsible. And there's growing antagonism to Netanyahu and to the right-wing allies he has, because nobody's speaking to the Israeli public. The one group that is taking responsibility and sort of helping the Israelis respond to this, for example, hundreds of thousands of people have had to evacuate the south and have had to go places and have come to the middle of the country, hundreds of thousands from the north as well. And they're all in the middle of the country. Who's helping them get reacclimated? It's the leadership of the protest movements against the Netanyahu government that have been they've been organized all over the country to do these protests, and now they've used that same organizing acumen and institutional sort of residue to create schools and education and recreation and housing and healthcare for all these people. They're the ones who are gaining from this politically inside of Israel. Now, when that will happen, most people agree in Israel that they're just totally unified. They have to defeat Hamas. And that after the war, they'll deal with this, right? That after the war, they'll deal with this. But I don't think Hamas, for sure, Netanyahu's not staying in power. I can't see that as happening. He's done. But I think it's possible that a Likud government could remain, but not with the leadership of the right-wing coalition that also headed up the military establishment during this. Now, as far as Hamas, I think Hamas is going to be so weakened that they won't be able to reassert themselves on Gaza, not in the moment. The question is, can there be a voice of moderation that emerges in the West Bank, or will they be radicalized? And that is a big question, and I actually don't have a good answer for you for that. Right now, it seems like they're going to be radicalized. That any leadership that's going to get that's going to replace Abbas will be dug in that Israel is creating a genocide on Gaza. That's how they are. That's what people are saying right now throughout the Arab world. So I think that this is going to be a long term. This is going to affect generations of politics between Israel and her Arab neighbors. Yeah, please, Neil, go ahead.
So one other question would be, can you answer, do you know whether this, your session is archived? In other words, can someone in future access this session?
I don't know. I think probably through the Jewish Collaborative, yes.
Ria, can you respond to that question? I mean,
I'm pretty sure Rabbi Marsha, I think Rabbi Marsha's here, and I think they record all of these. I would ask that you be careful on who you share this with, only because as a professor at a university, I've already been targeted by people who find me to be.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I did not push this session to Facebook, but I did. It's fully recorded. Sylvia, I don't know if you can see. Is the button still flashing that it's still recording?
Yes, it is.
It is.
It is.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Yes. So what's gonna happen, Neil, is that this is available on the Advanced Learning. All of our sessions are available on the Advanced Learning Institute, part of our website. So Madalena will upload it later this afternoon, and possibly, yeah, and then you'll be able to access it and share it with anyone who you think might benefit from it. Okay.
Yep. Thank you very much.
And just I urge everybody to be thoughtful about who you share this with. I can't control that, of
Sure.
course, but
Of course.
but I've been called out on Instagram as being anti-Palestinian, which I pride myself at not being, and so felt really badly about that. Anyway, but I loved this, and I got something in the text about can you audit my class? No, you can't, Marjorie. I'm sorry. But because there's students in there, like, and obviously with such a sensitive topic, and I do a lot of discussion in the class. Actually, what I do, just so you know, is I ask the students to articulate what's the Palestinian narrative here on every step of the way, right? Whether we're talking about 48 or 56 or 67. So they need to know the facts. I kind of do that in a lecture, but then I ask them, so how did the Palestinians see this? How did the Egyptians see this? How did the Zionists see this? So we have discussions like that. And so because of that, I don't really want to involve observers who are, older than 30. Let's put it that. But I do think, I did teach this class. I did teach a 10-session class at one point for the collaborative, and maybe I'll do it again.
I don't know. Can you hear me still? Am I still on?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I also wanted to say, Marjorie, that all the classes that Scott taught, except one, were recorded and also available. So you could actually go through the 10-week, it ended up being 12, the 12-week course that he taught last spring at your leisure, and that's available on our website.
Thank you.
So yeah, so at least start there. And my guess is that what'll probably happen, I'm going to ask Scott to, in a like probably 6 months from now, do something like a shared narrative, but about the situation that we're dealing with right now. Not historical as much as, different facets of looking at current history and what lies ahead.
Okay.
Because I think that'll be really interesting. And this is the first Scott's hearing about it, so there you go.
Well, I'm going to have to this is tremendously challenging, and just from an intellectual perspective, but of course I too am emotionally deeply affected. So my two daughters both spent significant time in Israel last year. I visited my youngest daughter in Israel, in Jerusalem. I'm a Zionist, proud to say that. And I'm just horrified by what's happened. And I'm devastated by it's hard to find hope. I mean, Ria, I think you were looking for some way to think about this, and hopefully the only silver lining that I see in it right now is that there will have to be new leadership, and hopefully we can pray that the public, the Palestinians and the Israelis who want so badly to have peace, so the vast majority of both Palestinians and Israelis want peace, that they'll find ways to put leaders in place that can get us there. But that's a big, tall order given the intensity of this situation. All right, why don't we say goodbye? And I hope you guys
Thank you, everybody, for attending. And I will look for a message from the Joy email box about who's going to join us next week. This conversation will continue, and I'll have more details very soon. Okay? Thank you so much, and thank you, Scotty, for a very, very informative lecture. You covered a lot of ground really quickly, but very helpful.
Thank you too. Bye.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for being our teacher.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.